De-extinction. It's a word most of us wouldn't have even known about just a few years ago, but one that's now regularly cropping up in the news. The cast of characters set to get the treatment include the woolly mammoth, dodo, thylacine, moa and direwolf, animals most people would never expect to see anything like. But is all of that about to change? It's a thorny subject, one that sparked much debate as people question what it means to be a species, to be brought back, or even what it is to be classified as alive. But there's also lots of hope as to what the emerging technologies could achieve in our effort to conserve existing species and prevent them from ever joining the list of potential de-extinction candidates. So, join us as we look at where de-extinction has got so far and what some of the questions are we should all be asking as this emerging technology unfolds. I'm your host, Rachael Funnell, and this is The Big Questions. First up, we asked Matt James, Chief Animal Officer for the de-extinction company Colossal Biosciences, to explain what they mean when they talk about de-extinction.
De-extinction is this really weird idea to begin with that people don't really have a full grasp of. And then when we sort of really bring the nuance in of like what is functional de-extinction, I think it deserves a lot of time and explanations. So for us, the whole concept of de-extinction is this idea of using emerging biotechnology tools in order to restore species that have been lost typically due to human activity. However, we talk about functional de-extinction, which is this idea that we understand that although we cannot create a 100% exact replica of a species we have lost, we can restore the historic phenotypes and the role and the function of that species to an ecosystem. So a great example would be the thylacine, the Tasmanian tiger that we're trying to restore. And we are focused on the key phenotypes that will create an animal that looks identical to the thylacine as we know it. But more importantly, we're restoring phenotypes and roles within an ecosystem in Tasmania that need the function of an apex predator. So by restoring the function of the apex predator, we're able to control things like wildlife disease and invasive species and mesopredator populations to help create a healthier ecosystem. So functional de-extinction is really focused on restoring key functions to ecosystems that are currently degraded and in need of a specific function for restoration.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting way of looking at it in terms of what the influence that animal could have if it was still around. And I mean, I feel like it's a good time to point out that also the target species that you've got, am I correct in thinking they're all ones where humans may have been kind of connected to their disappearance?
Yeah, exactly. I think all the species that we're working with, we're really focused on what are species where we can draw a direct line to human activity that helped either contribute or was the primary cause of their extinction.
And what is the kind of ultimate goal as you guys work towards de-extincting the 5 target species?
The ultimate goal is to create, as close to the replica of that lost species as we can, restore those species to the wild through rewilding efforts, through a big network of conservation partners and government alliances, in order to restore those functions to ecosystems. As we begin to put animals back into an ecosystem, we can shore up the stability of that ecosystem in a way that has a net positive benefit to nature and to humanity. So if you think of ecosystems like a Jenga puzzle, every time we lose a species in that ecosystem, we're removing a block from the Jenga puzzle and that tower's losing its stability. Colossal and de-extinction represent the first ever opportunity for us to begin to put blocks back into the Jenga puzzle, be able to restore stability to an ecosystem. So like I mentioned with Tasmania and the thylacine, we can bring an apex predator back in a way that shores up an ecosystem that's experiencing high loads of invasive species and wildlife disease. We focus on things like the dodo. You're restoring a seed disperser back to a natural area where trees like the ebony tree were once prolific, and because of the distribution of those seeds. Or if we look at woolly mammoths, we can actually recreate an extremely biodiverse ecosystem in the circumpolar north that was once as biodiverse as the African savanna is today. So you sort of have this net positive lift of biodiversity. So we're really focused on finding rewilding opportunities with our de-extincted species in order to improve biodiversity, improve ecosystem stability.
In 2025, Colossal announced they had created a woolly mouse, a genetically engineered creature that demonstrated how we can search for the genetic basis of an extinct animal's phenotype and bring it about in another animal, one alive today. As evolutionary biologist and Colossal's chief science officer Beth Shapiro told me, it was a critical step towards their goal of having a woolly mammoth by 2028.
One of the biggest challenges that we have in making a mammoth is that we have to figure out what it is that we need to edit in the DNA sequence of the Asian elephant, which is the closest living relative of the mammoth, if we want to take this tropically adapted proboscidean elephant and turn it into a woolly animal that's capable of living in cold parts of the world. And so one of the ways that we're doing this is we're trying to use different ways of testing hypotheses about links between genome sequences and the way an animal looks and acts. And we can do things like measure things in cells in culture. We can differentiate cells into different organ types or tissue types and test hypotheses there. But a whole animal model is really useful for just looking at the ultimate consequences of these DNA edits. An elephant, though, has a 22-month gestation, and also they're elephants, an endangered species that we don't want to be doing experiments like this on if there's a much simpler way to do this. And with a mouse, there is. A mouse has a 20-day gestation. It's also a mammal. They're quite distantly related to each other, about 200 million years of evolution. But there are still the same genes and gene families that are associated with traits like woolliness in an elephant and a mammoth as occur in mice. So the way we did this, we didn't just shove mammoth genes into a mouse. That wouldn't make any sense. But we used our alignments of mammoth DNA sequences to narrow down the parts of the genome where all the mammoths that we've sequenced so far are the same as each other, but different from an Asian elephant. And these are hypotheses about what it is that makes mammoths more mammoth-like. And then we looked in the mouse literature, and we're fortunate that with mouse as a really important model system for developmental biology and genetics, that there's tons of information out there linking specific variants and lots of different genes in mice with a physical phenotype, like the coat phenotype. And so where this list overlapped, where we found that there was an interesting change in mammoths and also an interesting change in the mouse version of those genes that led to a predictable phenotype, this was the sweet spot. And to test our ability to edit multiple things at the same time, we picked 10 of those genes and we edited all of them at the same time. In some of our mice, we have different combinations of them. So the most edited mouse has changes to 7 different loci. There's actually 8 edits, but one of them is edited in 2 different places. And we have our ultra woolly mice.
It shows that not only is the mouse model a great model for us to test some of the editing that we're already currently doing in our Asian elephant cells that came from our mammoth and Asian elephant comparative genomic analysis. So not only is it great from a timing to test those phenotypes, the entire de-extinction pipeline, right, which includes some of the somatic cell nuclear transfer work, some of the advanced embryology work, all of that, all of our QC work and screening our cells to ensure that we're only picking cells with edits that don't have off-target effects that would be detrimental to the animal welfare of the animals that we're making, and being very, very thoughtful in the selection. So there's a lot that goes into our end-to-end de-extinction pipeline. And in September, we literally married it into mice, right? And so what's been great about that is, you're seeing, full grown mice. And so it's not like they were born yesterday. And so not only does the mouse model work wonderfully for us testing our phenotypes or physical attributes in a living animal model and testing our QC process and everything to ensure that we're only making edits that enhance the animal and have no off-target or negative unintended consequences to it. We also did it very, very quickly. And so it shows that the end-to-end pipeline that we spent a lot of time and effort and money building over the last few years for all of our extinction species is now working nearly immediately in mouse. And so, like I said, there were no really unintended consequences except adorability. We didn't think that they would be as cute as, I mean, they are. And, we're starting to get the question already of like, are you going to sell them? Can we have them? Are you going to release them back into the wild? And we're not going to release them in the wild. We're not selling them. I know we talk a lot about rewilding at Colossal, but we are just very, very excited that the pipeline worked. It worked immediately. We saw the phenotypes that we were expecting from the editing engineering. And we also did it in a way where we produced all healthy, viable mice because of our QA screening process at the end of it. So it showed that the whole system worked. And, besides being extra cute, everything else came out as predicted.
That second voice was Ben Lamm, CEO and co-founder of Colossal Biosciences, who I met after his appearance at South by Southwest in London, where he hosted a session with actor Sophie Turner. Yes, that Sophie Turner, of Game of Thrones fame, which was a fitting choice because they were there to discuss, among other things, Romulus, Remus and Khaleesi, 3 pups that were created using functional de-extinction to bring about the phenotype of a direwolf in a gene-edited grey wolf. Those gene edits were directed by ancient DNA extracted from 2 remains, a 13,000-year-old direwolf tooth and a 72,000-year-old direwolf skull, resulting in what Shapiro described as a pretty good quality genome for both. The remains were separated in age by around 59,000 years, but they both showed variants of DNA in their genomes that suggested their coats would have been light-coloured, with dense, long and thick fur. They also would have had more musculature than wolves alive today, with larger jaws and heads. In total, Colossal made 20 edits to 14 loci in the grey wolf genome to bring about these traits. They then cloned that animal, and 3 pups were born. So, I asked Ben how they were doing.
They're doing great. So I'm actually going to see them next week. So I haven't seen them in a couple weeks. But I can show you this. Obviously, it won't come through on your podcast. So this is Remus yesterday, Remus and Romulus in the background there, and they're doing great. They've got they're growing well. They're absolutely gorgeous, and they just continue to grow. So they're doing amazing. We're in the process, probably the next couple weeks, to start the integration of Khaleesi into the pack, and then we'll start on kind of engineering the next litter and then putting them into the pack next. So that's our goal.
I mean, I know you guys have said that, like, obviously you screen all this stuff so closely and so the changes that are going to happen. But has there been anything that surprised you? Because I always remember Beth mentioned about how, like, there's just nothing quite as good as the full animal model.
It's a good question. So a couple of things that surprised us are, we knew what the color of the coat was, and we knew what genes were going to drive the coat, but there's no preserved direwolf fur, right? And so that we know of, at least, right? I shouldn't say never, we don't like to say never, but we've never seen any. And so it was cool to actually see it. And so it's like when they were born, they're almost like little baby polar bears, and they're so fluff balls, and you can see it from the photos. It's like so thick, and their tails are much thicker than a normal wolf's, and so it's almost like a fox-like tail, which is crazy. And they've got this like mane down their back, which is pretty, like, starts their head and kind of goes down their back, which is pretty awesome.
I mean, you had some hands-on time with them, at least when they were small.
Yeah.
Has that kind of stopped now?
So I did when they were small. I was working, and I got to bottle feed them some and hang. Oh yeah, it was great. But they're wolves, and they're transitioning more and more to being more like we went from being on the mom to then doing bottle feeding to dry food, then dry mixed wet food, and now they're doing carcass eating, where they're kind of like learning social dynamics of like eating. So Matt James and his teams have done a fantastic job.
As the Chief Animal Officer at Colossal Biosciences, Matt James leads the animal operations to ensure the health, safety, and well-being of the animals in their care. He's got over 15 years of experience in animal care and management, and has been there since day dot for Romulus, Remus, and Khaleesi.
It was one of those kind of surreal moments of your life, of your career, when we were in the surgical suite with the surrogates, and they were born via cesarean section. So to see them sort of come out and work with them immediately to sort of agitate them, revive them, get them taking those very first puppy breaths was absolutely incredible. It really put into context the amount of work that went into the creation of the dire wolf, but at the same time was almost humbling in terms of how quickly we were able to achieve it. Because now, we're coming up on almost a year since Romulus and Remus were born. They were born last October. So to think about, all that's happened in that 1 year time frame with those two, and now the introduction of Khaleesi to the pack as well, has just been, certainly the highlight of my career.
Yeah, I remember when I spoke to you guys on the day when it kind of broke in the press, and I had no idea what the call was going to be about. And then you obviously told me, and I was so sort of blown away that I remember at the time I was like, so have you spent much time with them? And you were like, yeah, I'm Chief Animal Officer, of course, but I didn't realize you're literally there from the minute they were born. That's incredible.
It's one of the really humbling responsibilities of the role, but also the most unique privilege that I could imagine is to sort of be present for the birth of the first ever species restored from extinction. To be part of these unique animals' lives has been incredible. And to make sure that, somebody that you trust, obviously yourself, is at the helm, ensuring that the welfare of these animals is paramount. So it's, for me, as being an animal care professional, it's always been really important to make sure that individual animal welfare is paramount as we focus on restoring populations of animals. And to see that those three create their own little pack and to thrive out in their ecological preserve has just been absolutely astonishing.
What's the kind of plan for them now?
So we're lucky that we are able to create this large, expansive ecological preserve where they live out their lives, and their plan is to continue to be there, and we'll continue to study them. We'll focus on things like the genetics and epigenetic effects of cloning and genetic editing, which will drive de-extinction science and have this sort of cascading effect through all conservation science. We'll continue to try to observe and understand more about their social ecology and their social behavior, how they interact with each other. We'll figure out things about anatomy, physiology, and nutrition. So they are this amazing living laboratory right now. We'll continue to focus on making sure that they experience optimal welfare and they're living the grandest life possible. But the plan is they're going to stay on this secure ecological preserve, which will allow us to ensure their safety, but also learn a lot about de-extinction. And you continue to use them as this amazing communication device to share with the world what is feasible today. Science and the exploration of science is obviously an unpredictable sport, but we feel really good that we're on pace and we're targeting our deadlines really well. So the mammoth seems like it's certainly on target, which is interesting for somebody like me because that puts a lot of pressure on our team to figure out that very question. Who takes care of these animals? Where do they live? What's the lifetime plan? So for every species that we focus on, whether it's moas and dodos or thylacines and mammoths, we're creating these cradle to grave plans. So how do we take care of the individual animal from birth to death? And how do we ensure optimal welfare along the way? So those are through really unique efforts that we call animal care manuals. So with the dire wolf, we created the world's first animal care manual for a species that hasn't existed in 12,500 years. An incredible effort, a lot of fun. So that takes a lot of research, understanding the health, the welfare, the management needs of closely related species, and extrapolating our data and making sort of really educated guesses in how you would care for these species in human care. So in the case of the mammoth returning in 2028, they would live in these highly managed animal care facilities that Colossal is designing and building that is focused on taking care of the individual animals. And then understanding that it takes generations from the creation of the first animal of its species to actually rewilding. So to getting an animal back into the wild where it's truly independent, that takes generations. It's a very stage-gated process. So we're also developing plans that we call conservation assessment and risk evaluation plans, which are focused on the feasibility of the creation of the animal, all the ethical, legal, regulatory concerns, everything from what stakeholders should be involved in the process of taking an animal from an animal care facility into a rewilding scenario, and then developing those plans over years and years and years. So we're currently launching that effort as well, with the anticipation that would be complete in the next 18 months. And that would really sort of highlight, these are the target areas where, when the mammoths are getting ready to leave, highly managed animal care facilities, and they're going to more semi-wild scenarios, these are the areas of the world that we would be projecting that they should live in. These are the people that will be stakeholders and stewards of these animals. And these are the plans, that stage-gated plan to get us to truly independent, wild, self-sustaining populations.
This capacity to meet the animal's needs is one factor of de-extinction that's been met with scrutiny, as some question how capable we really are of creating a suitable environment for an animal that hasn't existed for thousands of years. This is captured in the concept of lifeways, an idea shared by author and historian Professor Sadiah Qureshi, who recently wrote Vanished, an Unnatural History of Extinction.
I think when most people encounter extinction, they tend to think of it in terms of species. So a very particular species going lost, whether it's the dodo or the grey hawk or dinosaurs, the T-Rex. But I wanted to think about, instead of thinking about species as this sort of technical scientific idea, I wanted to encourage readers to think about what it means to be alive in a particular way. So I often spoke about ways of being or life ways instead, and that was very much to try and find an unfamiliar word that had this sort of resonance with ways of being alive. Because I think when we think of extinction as limited to species, we tend to forget that it can mean the extinction of ways of being, lots and lots of different ways of being alive in the world. So I think Lifeways captures that sense of, through its unfamiliarity, that sense of being alive in the world.
Yeah, it really does. And it definitely kind of made me think more comprehensively about how, if a species, even if you are just focusing on the idea of species, for them, they don't exist within a vacuum of just similar animals, do they? They interact with their entire environment. So to imagine that broader concept was really powerful for me. And I thought, as someone who's done this really comprehensive look at extinction, that you'd be a really great person to speak to about this emerging idea of de-extinction. So at the moment, that's this sort of process by which ancient genotypes are selected from extinct animals' genomes and edited into extant relatives to bring around these sort of similar physical traits. So just as a sort of starting point, what is your outlook on the idea?
I have very mixed feelings about de-extinction, partly because I think our emotional investment in it as an idea, and I mean as humans, is partly because is driven by grief and pangs of loss. And I don't think, and I understand that, but I don't think it's necessarily the same thing as thinking about what is good for bringing back any particular species, for instance. And every time I've seen it discussed, people tend to think of it in terms of, perhaps we can engineer ecosystems, or perhaps we can create proxies for lost species, or perhaps we can just get away from the idea of extinction as this terrible, terrible thing, and actually we can, through technological bravado, bring back animals so that we won't feel those pangs of loss. But I don't think any of those are really getting to the heart of what extinction means, and how we cope with it, how we process it, how we relate to it. And I don't think that's necessarily thinking about what is best for the species. Even when people talk about potentially bringing back species as a form of justice, it's what we owe those species. Again, I understand that, but I think that often disguises the fact that we are actually not resurrecting or bringing back those particular species. De-extinction is creating new life forms. So I think that argument about justice is actually misleading.
Yeah, and I think that's an interesting idea with it being a kind of new life form, because I was going to ask, if we are to be bringing back, ways of being, how could we fulfill the needs of these animals? But I suppose maybe it should be a different question of, how do we know what way of life to provide for these animals that are, in a sense, kind of a new animal, as you say?
I think this is partly the problem with the way that de-extinction is marketed as a continuity of older life forms, whether it's bringing back the mammoth or bringing back the dire wolf or these kinds of things. And obviously we can create animals or species that look like the ones that we have lost, and we can feel better about it that way. But there's actually all those ways of being alive, that are being lost. We have to really think carefully about what we're doing here, because essentially by making a claim such as we're going to make mammoths de-extinct, or that we've already brought back dire wolves, what we're really doing, I think, is reducing animals to some kind of genetic existence. And we're saying because these things because they look the same, and we can classify them genetically as this species, we've resurrected something. But I think that really, really robs us of the sense of what it was to be that way of being when it was alive, whether it was like in mammoth herds, for instance, or packs like wolves or group animals, and so I think there's a sense in which discussions about de-extinction really try and kind of make the most of these genetic continuities, or at least these sort of physical resemblances, without really thinking about what that means for how we're treating life itself.
Yeah, I think this point of kind of reducing animals to their genetic information, you kind of raise in the context of de-extinction and other genetic technologies like freezing genomes. What could be the sort of potential consequences of looking at animals in this reduced way?
I think there are several ways that it's already affecting how we relate to animals. One is the reduction of them to their genomes, and thinking of species as things that we can sort of tinker with and engineer for our benefit, rather than thinking about their own existence. So there's that ethical qualm. But there is also the question of who counts as alive, or who counts as dead, and who counts as extinct. So the IUCN, for instance, at the moment, designates a species as extinct when the last living member is said to have died, when all reasonable kind of assumptions about it being alive, are not possible because we think it's dead. So obviously there are very, very famous endlings like Martha the passenger pigeon or Benjamin the thylacine. And when we know of particular endlings, we can mark that passing. But what happens when we have frozen their genomes and archived their genomes? We have to think, well, are those dead? And that might sound like a kind of just an abstract philosophical question, but it's not, because there's already discussion about how we treat those archives, both within the humanities and from scientists themselves. So for instance, one geneticist, person involved in de-extinction projects, has already proposed that we think of species that are frozen as evolutionarily torpid, so as a kind of inactive state rather than being completely gone. And for him, if we then resurrect a species or bring back a species from this frozen archive, they were never actually extinct in completely, because they always existed because there was this genetic continuity. So these I think are really, really important ethical and philosophical questions about quite literally what we mean by somebody or something being alive that is being brought into focus by de-extinction. I think it's entirely possible that technologies that are being used to bring back animals or other species will create technologies that can help engineer species, like for instance introduce genetic diversity or edit genes and things like that, so that where you have small populations, for instance, you introduce genetic diversity to them. But I think we need to be very, very careful of assuming that kind of skill or expertise would require de-extinction as it's being currently promoted. I think there's a lot to be said about, well, if that's the aim, then why not focus on living species? Why not focus on the ways of being that we still have and helping them? And sometimes the argument is, well, for instance, the cost alone of bringing back a extinct species, it will be astronomical. And the argument is, well, this doesn't necessarily take away from current conservation, because we're being funded by philanthropists and so on who want to support de-extinction but might not be interested in conservation. But I think, again, that raises the question of who should decide and who should have the power to make those decisions. And I think it's quite concerning if we end up deciding it should be the rich, or those people who have money, especially when that money has been accumulated in unequal economic systems, for instance. So there's a lot of kind of issues about how de-extinction relates to conservation, which is both about the actual technologies themselves, but also the broader ethics of how we think about the economics of conservation and how we think about what we owe to the lives that we share Earth with. Although I have very serious reservations about it, I think my main concern, certainly in terms of this podcast and in terms of communicating to people, is that they do think about these kinds of issues and make up their own mind and be informed about these kinds of debates, which is partly why I'm so glad to be contributing to this podcast, because I think this is something that is happening irrespective of how we feel about it, and it is something that we should be aware of, and I think we need to think about much, much more thoughtfully, because it has so many ramifications for basic things or questions about who counts as alive. But I think it also raises the question and the idea that extinction isn't just a natural process. It is this unnatural process in terms of either de-extinction, but also in terms of how we think about it. So extinction has become a political choice in the modern world. It's about where we invest resources. It's about what we choose to save, what we choose to bring back. And I think once we recognize that extinction is a political decision rather than just some technological puzzle or rather than just some biological process, I think it really benefits us in terms of the conversations that we're having about life on Earth and how we best respect it, protect it, and find a way for all of us to thrive.
It's clear if you look online that de-extinction is a topic already sparking much debate. And I mean, as it should. After all, science is a discipline that celebrates such conversations, and we only ever move forward by being open and inclusive as we figure out, as Qureshi put it, how to find a way for all of us to thrive. Genes are a big topic when it comes to finding a way for endangered species to thrive, however, and the issue of genetic variation in endangered species is one that's already sparked a collaboration between Colossal and Biorescue. That's in the ongoing effort to save the northern white rhino. It wasn't long ago that a devastating side effect of El Niño saw heavy rains wash away the top layer of soil in Kenya, releasing a bacteria that lives for hundreds of years and produces a deadly toxin. Those toxins killed a southern white rhino who had been enrolled in a world-first effort to perform rhino IVF. An autopsy following her death yielded a heartbreaking image of a 70-day-old rhino fetus that died with her. It was a devastating moment for the biorescue team, but it did show that the method works. They are now continuing their efforts to see if a surrogate southern white rhino could carry a northern white rhino to full term, but once it's born, we face a new problem in trying to rebuild the genetic diversity that's been lost as the species was driven to near extinction. Here, Colossal hopes to offer some assistance.
The northern white rhino is the most endangered rhino species in the world. There's only 2 left in existence. It's a mother-daughter pair, so obviously they won't be reproducing. So Biorescue was formed years ago with this idea of creating assisted reproductive technologies that would allow us to use southern white rhino surrogates to restore the northern white rhino population, and they've made great headway. However, when you experience such a huge reduction in your population like the northern white rhino has experienced, you lose a lot of genetic diversity. As you might imagine, if you just pick 2 random people out of the human population, it wouldn't be very representative of the entire global population. So there's a lot of genetic diversity lost in that selection process. So Colossal has teamed up with Biorescue to develop a technological pathway that allows us to explore historic northern white rhino population genetics, so we can understand what was the northern white rhino population before we lost 99% of the population, and then understand what is existing today in the 2 remaining northern white rhinos and the cell lines that have been banked. And then we can identify alleles that were lost over time, so genes that are responsible for very specific traits that might improve things like adaptability, disease resistance, improve genetic diversity. And then we're creating gene editing targets so that we can begin to edit northern white rhino cell lines to help bring back those lost genetics. And so then as biorescue has success in restoring the northern white rhino and in growing its population demographically, Colossal can help address the genetic diversity of that growing population and ensure it's as diverse and healthy as possible.
Genetic diversity is also a problem for the American red wolf, considered the world's most endangered after it was hunted as part of predator control programs in the 1960s. During the direwolf de-extinction project, they also created 4 non-invasively cloned red wolf pups called Hope, Blaze, Cinder, and Ash, and it's hoped their work can continue to contribute to a much-needed boost in genetic diversity for the species.
Well, so the deep dive into the genetics, genomics, gene engineering needs of wild canids has immediately created a benefit for the American red wolf. So the American red wolf is the world's most endangered wolf. There's fewer than 20 left out in the wild. There has been a captive breeding and release program underway since 1980 that's led by U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. What we've identified is a unique population of sort of coyote and red wolf admixture in Louisiana and Texas. And what that is powerful because now we have the genetic engineering tools thanks to direwolf. We have the understanding of the genomic analysis and the genome engineering needs in order to begin to use the unique genetics of that population in Louisiana and Texas and begin to create a technological bridge that would allow us to genetically rescue what is a very bottlenecked population in the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service recovery program. So what's really amazing about de-extinction is this amazing engine that drives innovation, investment, attention, media awareness, behavior change around the focus of de-extinction, but immediately tangible benefits to critically endangered species today. So, the dire wolf is immediately contributing to saving the American red wolf, the world's most endangered wolf and the United States' only endemic wolf. By pursuing the woolly mammoth, we've already created a vaccine that's protecting elephants against a horrible disease called EEHV, which claims about 30% of all elephants in human care. Working with the Tasmanian tiger, we've identified genome engineering tools that are allowing us to confer a resistance to a toxin that's brought into the Northern Territory and is killing northern quolls in Australia due to an invasive cane toad population. So each of these programs creates these really unique opportunities for us to make immediate change and help benefit critically endangered species. And a lot of that's led by the Colossal Foundation. So I have the unique privilege where I'm the chief animal officer with Colossal Biosciences. I also get to be the executive director of our nonprofit, our 501c3 foundation, the Colossal Foundation. And so we talk about Colossal's focus on generating technologies to restore species from extinction. The foundation is focused on applying those technologies to literally keep species off of our to-do list for de-extinction, right? How can we prevent future extinctions while reversing past extinctions?
That goal of giving a leg up to existing conservation efforts is something a new initiative from the Colossal Foundation aims to support, called the Colossal Foundation Species Reintroduction Fund, and as Matt told me, they already have a few things in the pipeline.
This is one of my favorite initiatives. So when we were dreaming up the foundation, we were trying to think of all of the amazing initiatives and how we can tie that closely to the amazing de-extinction efforts at Colossal Biosciences. Species reintroduction is a really powerful way to help shore up ecosystems. Like I was mentioned about restoring a lost species to an ecosystem can help restore stability and function to an ecosystem. But we can do that with species that have been extirpated from certain regions or completely extinct in the wild. So we were really focused on creating this program where we could try to identify these conservation projects that were at specific sort of developmental phases where an injection of funding and support could quickly accelerate to get those species back in the wild. So we're really excited. We just went through the first grant process where we put out a request for participation. People presented to us what they thought they could do with some additional support, and we selected 5 amazing programs. So, we're working on everything from helping restore condors to new regions of the Western United States, to rewilding, small fish in Mexico, and then working with tamarins and a bunch of other species that we're focused on this idea that we can help these projects get across the finish line, essentially. So every year we'll do this effort. We'll take a new group of grant applicants and focus on how we can invest in their projects. Then, in the case of some of those projects, we've already selected 2 that we're kind of pulling out of the Species Reintroduction Fund, and we're doubling down, actually much more than doubling down. We're committing to much more funding for species like the California condor that's being reintroduced by our partners at the Nez Perce tribe, and the Bolson tortoise, which is this really cool Pleistocene rewilding that's happening in New Mexico with Turner Endangered Species Fund. So those are going to become sort of more flagship projects for the foundation. And so it's a really cool sort of incubator system for us to identify new partners and meaningful projects that we can double down on.
This episode of The Big Questions went live in 2025, just 3 years off Colossal's goal to having a living, breathing mammoth. As we approach that moment in the de-extinction timeline, and whatever giant fluffy animals we may find there, it's a good time to get involved in the conversation about the pros and cons of this emerging field of science, as this seems like a big question that's going to raise many more big questions. The music and sound effects in this episode are credited to Audioblocks, Pixabay, and the BBC Sound Effects Library.